Hi, this is Eddie from A Mindful Emergence, and I want to say at the outset that this video is very different from what I normally produce and put on social media or have on my YouTube channel. And that is because today, right now, is September 13th, 2021. And 50 years ago today, a massacre took place at Attica Prison, or as it was called euphemistically, Attica Correctional Facility. And I was there. So my purpose in doing this video is to, first of all, talk a little bit about what happened and why it's important 50 years later that we know about this. And the second reason I do it is for purely selfish reasons, is that talking about it has value to me in terms of my own personal healing from that event because I was there. I was there in Attica, September 9th to 13th, during an uprising that happened because prisoners in Attica had decided to take over the prison. There was a spark that resulted in the prisoners seizing the prison and taking hostages. If you go back in time in September 1971, there's a couple things to point out. First of all, the political backdrop, there was a lot of evolving political consciousness, revolutionary consciousness that was evolving. It wasn't too long after Malcolm X was killed, Martin Luther King was killed. There were protests against the Vietnam War for civil rights and so on. So against that political backdrop, within prison, those of us in Attica and many other prisons in the United States were subjected to dehumanization and brutality. And I found myself there a year prior because of a drug arrest. I'd had a history of drug addiction, and that had resulted in me being sent to Attica. Instead of getting treatment, they decided to put me in a maximum security prison. And while I was in Attica, I was swept up in the political consciousness and political organizing that was going on. And there's a whole story about that I'm not going to get into. But as a result of that, the prison authorities decided to put my ass in a place called HBZ, or segregation. We called it the box. So in August of 1971, I found myself there. And on September 9th, there was a spark that lit an uprising where half of the about 2,400 prisoners in Attica seized a big part of the prison and took about 35 hostages and held them for several days, negotiating with the state of New York. And this was a long process. And it was a process where the prisoners came together. Now, it's important to understand that this was a predominantly, it was predominantly populated by African American and Latino prisoners. And the guards were, to a person, white. I think there might have been one Latino guard, but there were no African American guards. So there was this very repressive, racist environment. And among the prisoners, we had these different racial populations, and we all came together. We understood that rule number one to suppress people is you divide them. And we pushed through that and united despite different backgrounds, different political awarenesses, different political groups within inside Attica. We came together and were organizing prior to the uprising. So when the uprising happened, the prisoners gelled, and the prisoners put together a list of demands and stayed unified throughout the 10th, the 11th, the 12th, and the 13th. And finally, Governor Rockefeller and the commissioner and the warden decided to violently, brutally suppress this uprising. And they sent in state troopers and National Guard, and there were guards up on the roofs with their own rifles, illegally brought in, and they gunned down 39 people. 29 prisoners and 10 of the hostages were murdered. And they came in with guns blazing, despite the fact that helicopters had come in and dropped in some very strong tear gas that essentially paralyzed everyone. But they wanted to send a message. This is what happens when you stand up and make your voice heard. So while this was going on, I was in the box and I knew what was going on. And it didn't surprise me. And I was subjected to my own brutality. And I was severely beaten. And I'm not going to get into that. But what I want you to know is that if I walked into Attica right now, 50 years later, it probably wouldn't be much different. The prisoners are still mistreated and brutalized. You know, if you want to argue that when someone, quote, commits a crime, that they should go to a prison, fine, okay? But what you need to understand is that these prisons, for the most part, brutalize and dehumanize people, and they're not helping society as a whole at all. So this is what happens when you put people down. This is what happens when people come together and rise up and make their voices heard, demand to be heard. And there was a slogan that came out of this rebellion that's reverberated over the decades, and that is, Attica means fight back. Okay? Now, there's another phrase that has come into being in recent years, and that is, Attica is all of us. And over the last year or so, there's been an organizing effort by surviving brothers, because remember, this was 50 years ago. I was 23 years old, but most of the prisoners have died, and but some of us are still around. And attorneys that fought for the rights of prisoners fought to have the truth come out after this all happened, because there were lies. There were, you know, the state did not own up to their role in this. They blamed everything on the prisoners, of course. So there were attorneys involved and a lot of activists. And what they've done is they've created something called Attica is All of Us. And I've put the website link in the description with this video. You can go there, and there have been events taking place. Last Thursday on September 9th, I was part of a panel with 3 other Attica brothers, and we talked about events that had happened. I've been interviewed. I understand that on the website, my interview, as well as interviews with other former inmates, will be posted on there. But I encourage you to learn about this, okay? This is part of our history, and part of our history that needs to be told, because those of us inside, we were men. We were not animals, even though we were treated like that. And it's still happening. The rate of incarceration in this country is crazy. It's out of control. The highest proportion, from my understanding, of a population incarcerated of any country in the world. So I encourage you to find out more about prisons. And tonight, if you happen to watch this video on Monday the 13th, there'll be events taking place virtually. You can go to Attica is All of Us, get the information, and watch that. And just going back and talking about this over the last months and doing the interviews that I've done has brought this back to the surface for me. I've had to do a lot of personal work to heal the trauma of having gone through this. And doing this video is part of the healing that's taking place for me. And thank you for listening.